This podcast is brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Building, also known as CIOB, the world's largest and most influential professional body for construction management and leadership, with around 50,000 members in more than 100 countries. Our members, past and present, have had a hand in executing many groundbreaking construction projects across the world, from the Houses of Parliament in London and the Sydney Opera House through to venues for the Beijing and London Olympics. Chartered membership provides you with recognition of your abilities, knowledge, and experience within the industry, creating more exciting career opportunities. Don't forget to become a student member for free today. I'm your host, Monica Narasimhan. I'm the marketing and events lead representing Novus Victoria along.
Today we have our guest, Usha Iyer Raniga, who is a professor at the School of Property and Construction Management, RMIT University. Usha is co-leading the One Planet Network Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, United Nations 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, aligned with Sustainable Development Goal 12. The work directly impacts Sustainable Development Goal 11 on sustainable cities and communities. Usha is a member of the Chartered Institute of Building, Green Star Associate, and member of the International Education Association of Australia. She is a reviewer and scientific committee member for national and international referee journals and referee conferences. She's on the editorial board for referee journals and has worked on special issues. I'd like to welcome Usha to Conversations with Construction Connoisseurs. So welcome, Usha.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Could you please tell us a bit about what you do and your achievements, as I can never do justice to introducing you entirely by myself?
That's very kind of you, Monica. Thank you very much. So I started my undergraduate training in architecture. And then worked I'm originally from India, worked in India for a little bit, even while I was doing my degree. And then I decided that I wanted to do a master's in architecture. And so I took myself off to Canada, to a very beautiful place in Vancouver. And did my master's degree at the University of British Columbia, one of the most prettiest places on the planet that I've ever been to. And I worked in Canada for a few years as well while I was doing my degree. And then I found myself migrating to Australia in the early 90s. And when I moved to Australia, it was a really difficult time for the buildings and construction industry. Australia was going through a really severe and deep recession at the time. And out of my experience of doing my master's research in Canada, one of the things that was always at the back of my mind was a disconnect between research and the practice of architecture. And I had decided by then that I couldn't see myself as having a career in the design side of architecture. And I was very keen to bring in the practice and bridge that disconnect between practice and research. So I had but I wasn't yet ready to get back into an academic life, because PhD is a minimum of 3 years full time, and working as well. I decided that is this what I'm prepared to do, as people do. When you're doing a degree, are you prepared to have that long commitment to it? And so, and as I said, when I migrated to Australia, it was very difficult to find a job, but I did. I was working in an architectural practice. And during the course of my work in the architectural practice, we were doing a lot of designs, particularly hotel developments in the Pacific Islands. And that to me was a bit of a turning point, because the specification of the materials that we use in the design was largely concrete and cement and glass and steel and Italian marble, and not really sensitive to the needs of the locals, or sensitive to the context. And being a young designer in an architecture firm, I really didn't have much influence on appeasing the client or getting the client to think differently in those days. Of course, now things are a lot different. There's a lot more awareness of sustainability issues, and context-dependent design. That, thinking about passive design, thinking about local indigenous knowledge in the design and materials and construction and so on. So that sort of didn't sit well with me, and so I found myself ditching practice and going back to uni to do a full-time degree in doing a PhD, which was, I think, a bit of a turning point for me. So after my degree I completed my doctorate. I didn't actually do it in design. I did it in the realm of environmental planning, and very, very keen during my doctorate and then post my doctorate to ensure that whatever I did had that very practical intent at the end of the day. So, there may be several steps before the research is converted into or translated into practice, but I was very, very keen to ensure that continued. And that's a philosophy that I follow even today. With everything that I do, I'm very keen that the ultimate message is something that changes the way we do things. And we cannot continue, we'll never advance as a society. And there is no benefit to the research if you're not able to change the practice of how we do things. So through a series of other things that happened, which I won't sort of go into a chronological sequence now, but through other things that happened, I found myself working in various roles with that practical element driving everything that I do. So I worked initially in academia, and then I moved to government, and in private practice, in a consulting role. And then eventually moving back again into academia after having a reasonably large stint in government. And what I think about now when I think of my initial start of my working life in academia and my working life now in academia, I see a huge difference. And the difference again is the ability to connect with stakeholders, varied stakeholders, and the ability to ensure that the solutions are present to the problem has got a very practical benefit. And the importance of monitoring, continuous monitoring, and ensuring that the continuous monitoring assists in supporting change for the better. So there is, I can now, when I look back on my life, I can see the differences. And while a number of academics would be really interested in the publication side of the career and building up a research profile through publications, through the sort of the standard academic litmus test of your measure, through citations, through grants, and so on. I have always been guided by what I find as being of value, and that has held me in good stead. So I feel that I haven't compromised myself in any way, and that has spurred on and supported me to where I am today.
Awesome, that's super insightful. Thank you for that. We'll be moving on to the second part of our podcast where we'll touch base on career development. So, on a personal note, I want to share a bit about my backstory for the next question I'm about to ask you. Growing up as a South Asian, my family has always envisioned me pursuing a career at the UN, or the United Nations. But I grew up to be as an introvert, so I didn't really muster the courage to take part in model UN activities back in school. So now that I'm already here, working and contributing to the built environment, I do want to reconsider a career path at the United Nations. So what do you think are some of the key drivers to landing your role at the United Nations? Is that something you always wanted to do, and how did you get here?
That was my dream. So when I was young, my dream was to work with the UN. But there are essentially two career paths. So before I get into that, let me just explain a little bit about what I do with the UN. So I think when I say to people that I work with the UN, they immediately think that I being paid for by the UN. I'm not. So my association and the work that I do with the UN is through my role at RMIT. So I'm contributing pro bono half of my time, half of my RMIT salary position time, to be co-leading the UN Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program as part of the One Planet Network. So it's not a direct payment role as a recruit of the UN, but that doesn't mean that you cannot influence the work that you do. The work that you do can still be influenced in industry with an intergovernmental or an international body such as the UN. So I want your listeners to sort of think about multiple pathways. There's not just the one pathway to get to where you want. And if you are very keen and you're true to your principles and you're true to yourself in terms of where you see yourself going, things will happen. You need to seize opportunities as they arise. So in terms of how I got into the current position of the UN, I was nominated. And I was nominated because I was doing work not directly associated with the UN, but I was doing work in the area of sustainable buildings and construction, and there were people who were involved in the work that I was doing, and so they approached me and they asked me. They said, "We need people like you." Who are interested in research, who are interested in changing the way sustainability is thought of in the buildings and construction sector, and we would invite you to apply, put in an expression of interest to apply for a position. So that then, and obviously I needed to get permissions from within the university to be able to do this, and support from within the university to do this, because clearly, I'm not on a half salary position. I'm on a full-time salary position, and so there were internal things that needed to take place to enable me to be able to spend half my time. But all that happened, and here I am. So typically, to work with the UN, there may be, and I'm sure there are more, but in my experience, there are two ways to get you there. One way is through school programs, university opportunities, internship programs, which are often led by the country. So usually by the Foreign Affairs or the Climate Change Department or something similar, Ministry of Environment, perhaps, depending on the country and how things are structured. Those are the avenues. So through your own country avenues, you can try and get a step into the UN. You've also got to remember that a lot of the roles with the UN, those type of roles with the UN, tend to be supported within the country, because the UN itself doesn't have a lot of money. The way the UN runs is not by its own income generation stream, but it's dependent on funding from a number of different countries. And so the pathway that I just described is a country supporting paying the salary. So a number of junior program officers enter different arms of the UN, whether it's UNEP or UNIDO, FAO, whatever that may be, through these programs. The other one is following what I did, which is you establish yourself in a particular area as an expert or as an advisor or an expert in a particular area, and that then opens doors, and it not just opens doors to the UN, but it also opens doors to other things, for being on boards, whether they're not for profit or paid positions on boards, in terms of industry recognition and industry associations, peak industry bodies, and so on. So if anyone is aspiring to have that role in the UN, and I must say that, from the time I was young, and then, my experiences of working in Canada, and then experiences of working in Australia, and then, having children, this was this childhood interest that I had of working with the UN, to me, was almost a pipe dream. And I never actually thought that, as a senior academic, I would actually end up having this opportunity to actually work with the UN. But I suppose I was lucky, and when the opportunity arose, I was able to pick up that opportunity and make the most of it. So I want your listeners to think about it optimistically, think about it from a positive spin, and there will be opportunities in your life. You've got to seize them and make the most of them.
Right. And how about if you've ever spoken to the General Assembly or different bodies or arms of the UN, did you get a chance to interact with them?
A lot of the things with the UN tends to be very bureaucratically driven. So no, I have not spoken at the General Assembly, because often, in order to be able to either be represented or to speak, there are certain channels that you need to go through. A good example is, for instance, our program, the Buildings and Construction Program, has had a very strong presence at the COP, the Conference of Party meeting. And in fact, at the COP that took place, COP 21, that took place in Paris, there was a very strong presence of the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, that was driven by United Nations Environment Program and the Ministry of Environment Finland, who are both co-leads of the program, as well as RMIT. So the Buildings and Construction Program is actually led by Ministry of Environment Finland, who's also a co-lead, obviously in terms of the activities of the program, as well as UN Environment and RMIT University, and I'm representative from RMIT University. And the reality of the situation is that I can't be, and because it's cash strapped, I've given my time, and one of my colleagues is giving half her time. So together we make up the coordination desk of the SPC program of one full-time equivalent. So it's not possible for the university to continuously, nor is it practical for any organization to continuously dip into its own funds to send delegates. So there have been times when I've had to choose out of 4 or 5 events that are taking place, which one do I want to go? Which one do I need to be at? So typically I have attended two types of events that my program has led. So I have been, in a sense, true to the cause of my program, Buildings and Construction Program, rather than UN as a whole, because to me that's more important. And so I have attended meetings that have been led by the Buildings and Construction Program. And usually we have one meeting face-to-face, where, because we're a program that is quite global, so we've got people from different parts of the world that are part of this program, and we only meet once a year. So I have been attending those meetings, and of course, because of the pandemic, we haven't had any of these meetings face-to-face, obviously. And the other program, the other meeting that I have been attending is a joint coordination desk program of all the 6 programs that makes the One Planet Network. So Buildings and Construction is one program of the One Planet Network. we've got a food systems program, we've got consumer information program, we've got tourism program, we've got procurement program, and we've got lifestyles and education programs. So once a year, in the past, all the 6 programs used to meet with the board, where we used to also have other UN programs such as representation from New York, UN New York. We've had the International Resource Panel, and UNOPS, UN Habitat. So some of the other UN agencies have also been involved in these executive planning meetings. So those are the 2 that I have attended in the past. And of course, last year and again this year, these are all being held virtually. And one of the downsides of being in Australia, with a lot of the stronger UN presence in Europe and in North America, has been the timing. So it's not unheard of for me to be attending a meeting at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, which can be very difficult. You can't sustain this on a long-term basis.
Yeah. Fantastic. That was super insightful. Moving on to the next or the third part of our podcast, we're going to be talking about career resilience and transition. So, according to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, TTP report, the construction industry is accounting for about 22% of global carbon emissions in 2014. So environmental sustainability is critical to combat the existential threat of climate change. And the IPCC has warned that the world needs to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, about the pre-industrial levels by 2030, in order to prevent the worsening of potential irreparable effects of climate change. So how do you feel the construction industry in developed countries are moving towards creating an environmental and economical sustainability program in comparison to developing countries?
This is such a great question. Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I mean, the time is now. Really, we don't have time to waste. If you think about the trajectory of the developed world, and particularly in the buildings and construction space, the types of materials that we have been using. There's an OECD report that talks about resource efficiency and talks about the outlook of material use, up to 2060. And it's quite frightening to think that if we continued with the current trends, then just cement and concrete alone is going to be responsible for 12% of global greenhouse gases. 12%. So the role of buildings and construction and the importance of buildings and construction from an environmental perspective and the impact that buildings and construction has on the planet, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of water use, in terms of our resource use, is being understood, but perhaps not fully understood, and not enough is being done about it. And certainly, when you think about the role of buildings and construction, it hasn't had the same. Even though that recognition is there, compared to, for instance, the power sector or the agriculture sector. And certainly even in the recent, out of the Paris Agreement, national determined contributions have, in a number of countries, been looking at the sectors that I've mentioned rather than looking at the importance of buildings and construction. And yet when you look at what is going on in the global south, particularly Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that's where a huge proportion of the world's population, 50% of the world's population, is going to be in this region over the next 20, 30 years. By 2050, the cities, the Dhakas, the Mumbais, the Lagoses, the Sao Paulos of this world are the ones that are going to be highly populated and that needs immediate and very effective transitions to start taking place now. So the bottom line is that these countries, these cities, need to quickly move from the old linear ways of uh, city building into more circular ways of city building. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that rather than looking at virgin material extraction that the developed world has been working on. So the way New York has been built, or London has been built, or Melbourne has been built, has been very much on extracting sand, extracting metals, and extracting materials that make up our current built environment. We can't afford to continue to do that. So we need to start thinking about how might we start looking at local materials, because one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted very clearly is that global supply chains have been affected by the pandemic. So we need to start moving away from these global supply chains into more local, maybe national, and maybe even more at a more granular level into local supply chains. We also need to start thinking about some of the impact that the indigenous societies have had on the planet. So if you look at the belt that I talked about, the global south, these are very old cultures. There has been a very strong indigenous presence in these countries for a very long period of time. And these indigenous cultures are very circular, thousands of years ago, because they ate local, they took local, so the materials were all local materials, and they perfected, mastered local techniques of doing things, and the local people therefore had jobs. So we need to start. I'm not suggesting that we go back 2,000 years to what life was like, but certainly it's a learning exercise where we can try and pick some of these things to respond to some of our current challenges. The other thing that we also need to start thinking about is this cookie cutter approach that we have to city building. Whether you're in Manila or Shanghai or Mumbai, you could look at all these tall buildings and it's more or less the same. We need to start thinking about a different way of city building. Now, I'm not saying that, that we shouldn't be having skyscrapers, but we need to also start thinking about this mixes of densities. We need to start thinking about local grids, mobility, transport, and all this sort of gets us to start thinking about how might we change the paradigm of learning from what has already happened in the developed world, and look at how might we use some of those lessons learned and undertake this paradigm shift into the developing world. And one of the things that this cookie cutter approach does not support is local bringing in or enhancing locality, local knowledge, local skills, local materials. And so there needs to be a re-education that needs to be undertaken. So as part of the work that we did last year in the Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, I led 8 reports that looked at the state of play of circularity in the built environment across Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Europe. And then we brought all that together with a global report where we came up with 10 recommendations on how might we start thinking about nudging this high growth global south into
In the context of moving towards a carbon-constrained future, building rating tools have emerged as a critical enabler for improving the environmental performance of the built environment. So could you please share with us some insights or recommendations from your research publications?
Okay, so many years ago, when I used to work in Victorian government, we were the first state, at that time, we were the first state in Australia that brought in the minimum standards for housing, 5-star regulations, and now, of course, it's 6-star. And we used to call it a bit of a Star Wars, and in a sense, it still is. Not obviously the Star Wars from the movies, but the Star Wars in the race at the time, and to some extent that race continues even now, to bring in rating tools to represent cutting edge knowledge on where buildings ought to be, and support the industry and give some guidance to the industry to assist in their trajectory towards sustainability. And I completely understand the need for rating tools. But I think what ends up happening in reality, in the practice, is that the rating tools become an end in itself. So you become, you have a 5-star building, 6-star building, the what is known as the best, carbon neutral building, or the world's best rated building. And to me, in a sense, it's meaningless because it's a number. A lot of these rating tools, and of course that has changed because of criticism over time, used to be very much about points chasing and number chasing to get to your 5-star or 6-star. And they used to be focused on design intent. Now it's moved from design to as-built. And this is good, but it's still not good enough. At the end of the day, the users of the building need to be in a building that's comfortable to work in, need to be in a building that's productive, need to be in a building that is efficient in terms of resource use, and so on. So I think the industry has still got a long way to go. And you might sort of say that I'm sitting a bit on the fence here. While I understand the need to bring in these rating tools, what I fear is when these rating tools become an end in itself. And we need to see this as a yardstick for us to measure and move in the direction of sustainability. So for instance, with circular economy, a number of the rating tools talk about recycling of materials. But circular economy is not about recycling materials. Circular economy is about fundamentally changing how you design, construct, and deconstruct buildings. So if you're talking about a building that's constructed today that doesn't have a plan, and we don't know what sort of materials have actually gone into a building to track and trace the different components of the building, then it's going to be really difficult for us to be able to deconstruct that building at the end of its life. So what I'm saying, essentially, Monica, is that we need to rethink again the systemic approach that we have taken. We have always taken this approach, of a building, somebody plans or designs, somebody constructs, somebody operates, and then at the end of its life, the whole thing is just demolished and, it's discarded. We've got to rethink this whole process. At the design stage, we also need to think about the deconstruction stage, because that will influence how we build a building. We also, the processes that are there to build a building should also be the processes that help us dismantle the building and deconstruct the building so we can reuse it. So with all this new technology around BIM, around 3D technology, you know, printing, 3D printing, off-site construction. We have a lot of capacity to be able to reduce the amount of waste, be more efficient and optimize our construction processes, use of a number of software that is becoming more and more important, especially with building performance, and the focus is moving away from pure design and build into building performance with tools like neighbors in the marketplace. So I think that we are still on a trajectory, and by no means have we or can we say that, you know, this is it and we have reached our goal. We still have a long way to go. And we also have a leadership role to play in this space, in that you know, countries around us, around Australia, particularly the Pacific Islands, are looking for leadership from Australia to help in educating, to help in capacity building, to help in reskilling their own labor forces. So we have a critical role to play, particularly when you start thinking about the SDGs and think about inequalities around SDG 10. We do have, and not just a social, but also an ethical, I think, commitment to play an important role in this space.
So do you think there is a risk of sustainability becoming a very female-gendered field within the construction industry? Do you think this will make it less respected within the industry?
No, not at all, actually. I think what is important, though, is to start that conversation from what has traditionally been a very gendered, male-dominated and very gendered industry. There are strengths that men bring in, there are strengths that women bring in, and I think it's going to be very hard to generalize because we are now talking about a world where, you know, we've got other types of genders as well, right? So we're talking about LGBTQI. So I would hate to sort of pigeonhole people into a gendered role, but I do think that there is a space for discussion in supporting either genders or non-genders to be comfortable in what they have to offer. I think traditionally the sort of the caring, nurturing responsibility have fallen to women, but you know, that has changed over time. We have male nurses, we have male teachers, we have male childcare workers. So, and likewise, you know, we have female doctors, we have females we have female prime ministers, we have females in other roles in life. So I think that the gendered debate, I think in some respects is actually an old one, but what we need to bring to the fore in discussions with the industry is more around paradigm shifts, recognizing limitations. Not everyone can do everything. Not everyone, I mean, nobody's perfect. So, you know, we need to start having more transparent and open discussions about people's knowledge, people's capacities, limitations, and bringing in specific type of, whether their roles or whether their skills, to help support a more rounded approach to the buildings and construction industry. You know, and that can be across things like interior spaces, the quality of interior spaces, but at the same time could be very high tech type of solution which appeals to a certain type of a mind, and how do you then ensure this sort of cross-disciplinary engagement, which to me also links very much into how we educate. We've become so skilled at dissecting and specializing, and this sort of narrow scoped approach, that we have forgotten what it is like to think holistically again. And we need some of that cross-disciplinary, cross-collaborative type of skills at the undergraduate level, where architects can speak to builders, can speak to project managers, can speak to interior designers, can speak to planners, city planners, can speak to facility managers, so that when students graduate, they're not an expert in the area other than the one they're graduating in, but they understand the language and they understand the imperatives of what it is like to work in the real world with a range of different disciplines that make up the built environment. And I think that type of conversation and that type of approach to education needs to start happening now before it's too late, because we've already got, in addition to the complexity of the built environment, we're also contending with things like climate change. So we can't afford to have this sort of approach of where, we're learning about mitigation approaches, and then 2 years later, we're starting to think about adaptation or resilience. It doesn't quite work like that, because we know that when you design, you need to start thinking about mitigation, adaptation, and resilience as part of the design. So you can't be putting a building on the ground that is going to be flooded in 2 years and say, oh, we should actually raise the building up so that we've got the capacity for the building to withstand floods, or create a landscape that could naturally slope the land so that the water could be collected somewhere. So we need to start moving away what I call a very Newtonian or a Western-centric approach. And this is why sometimes I think that some of those indigenous designs, which are very spiritual, often spiritually connected, which we probably don't quite understand now, but that's so important, the cultural aspect that has been honed in a number of cultures without really understanding from a Western lens or a Western-centric perspective. I think we need to sort of get ourselves re-educated a little bit more. Teachers need to be re-educated, but certainly the students need to be re-educated, and the university system needs to think about how this re-education can occur. But also importantly, the industry needs to be part of this re-education process, because ultimately the students are going to graduate and work in the industry. So it requires all these stakeholders to be able to talk to each other, which I don't think we've been doing very well up until this point in time.
Would you like to share us a go-to quote or a book that you really enjoyed reading that helps define your attitude to getting where you are today?
This reminds me of a TV program that my oldest son and younger son used to love watching. It's called Bob the Builder. And I love Bob the Builder's attitude of, can we do it? Yes, we can. We need that approach, because if we take the approach of we can't do it, it's too hard, it's too difficult, we don't even try, and we can't afford to think that the glass is half empty. We have to think that the glass is half full, because, I mean, I'm much older than you, and I think about the legacy I'm going to leave behind for my children and my students. I don't know if my children are going to have children, but I do worry about the next generation, and I don't think it's fair for the next generation to be inheriting a planet that is completely mucked up by us and the generations before us. So,
Absolutely.
can we do it? Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Usha, thank you so much for taking the time in sharing your experience on Conversations with Construction Connoisseurs, to be able to add your voice and perspective to this beautiful podcast series that Nova Victoria is super excited to deliver to our community. I hope you enjoyed the interviews, and I hope our listeners gained some fascinating insights about pursuing a doctorate degree in the higher education industry on sustainability and diversity in the built environment. So we just want to thank you so much once again for being part of this podcast, and hoping to catch up with you soon someday in the industry.
Thanks, Monica. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope your listeners get some value out of our conversation today.